So welcome everybody for the Princeton Finance Lectures 2022, or 2023, sorry. So Arvind is following in the footsteps of many great lectures we had over the last decades. And we're looking forward to your presentation. Arvind is one of the leading researchers in macrofinance, international finance, and many areas. He's from Stanford, and everybody knows him. Welcome, Arvind, and we're looking forward to your presentation on safe assets in the international context.
Okay. Thanks very much, Marcus. And thanks for having me here. I'm going to give two talks, and they are about safe assets. And the talks are about safe assets and the way in which they shape the structure of domestic economies as well as international. I have been thinking about these issues, I'd say, for like 15 years. And I initially got into this really because of asset pricing. I knew that treasuries were unusually priced, and so that's how I got into this. And as I've worked on this longer, I've realized it actually has implications for banking, monetary economics, and then the substance of most of what I'm going to talk about today as well as tomorrow is international, which is what I've been thinking about for the last few years. Okay, so the way what I've done is I'm actually going to present a paper today, a full paper. I hope you'll find it interesting. Interestingly enough, so that tomorrow you're interested in hearing about synthesis, which is I'm going to cover a couple of different papers and see how I connect some of these things up. But I thought it was useful, rather than doing a synthesis first, actually to just give you a complete thought about a particular issue. Okay, so here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a paper with my Stanford colleagues Antonio Coppola and Shenzi Xu, and here is the subject of the paper. So you probably all know that the dollar is the dominant currency of global finance, and one particular dimension of it, which is the dimension that we want to talk about, is that the unit of dollar denomination as a quantity of public debt and private debt is very large relative, say, the share of US GDP and world GDP. So there's just a lot of dollar debt out there. And at some level, this is just a manifestation of the reserve currency phenomenon, a particularly significant manifestation. So I could say the same thing about the pound sterling when the pound sterling was the reserve currency, and I'll talk more about this. I could say the same thing about the Dutch florin during a period when the Bank of Amsterdam was providing a reserve currency for the world. So this paper that I'm going to walk you through is a paper that offers a theory model that tries to explain why it is that the dollar, in particular, is the unit of denomination for such a large amount of debt. Okay, and the idea is really very simple. The idea is the following, which is you can think of the decision for a firm or a government to denominate a debt in some currency as a choice over what asset to hand over in order to extinguish the debt. Okay, and I'm using that word extinguish the debt to an asset to hand over to kind of make you think about a futures contract. Right? And so just like with a futures contract, you will be more enticed to denominate your debt in a unit in which you can get your hands on the asset that you need to deliver in order to extinguish your debt. That's a better form of financing. And so then the attraction of dollar debt is there is a ready supply of dollars. And when I mean dollars, what I really mean is short-term safe debt, T-bills, commercial paper, repo, bank debt. There's a large supply of that, so that if you are an issuer who chooses to denominate your debt payments in dollars, you can get your hands on some of this large supply of debt and then use it to settle to extinguish your debt. Okay, so that's the basic idea that I'm going to pursue. Now, to think about dominance, you need some type of endogenous feedback mechanism, right? You need something in which sort of the world pushes you in a direction and sends you even further there. So this mechanism that I just outlined naturally will give you such an endogenous feedback. Think, for example, about a firm that says, I will choose to issue dollar debt because there's a large supply of dollar debt, currently safe debt, that I can use to extinguish my current debt. So liquidity of the market is good. I'm going to provide more debt into that market. Some of that debt that's issued will end up increasing the stock of debt that is then available for others to use to settle their own debts. So that's naturally going to get you kind of an effect that feeds back on itself. And so that's the way that's the kind of the theory that I'm going to pursue. And the way we think about the world is what gets the process started is an initial supply of a large quantity of safe public debt. So in the US context, I'm going to think about this as T-bills. There was a large supply of T-bills that sort of seeds the process. You can use those T-bills to settle debt. Then the rest of the world privately builds up on that, both domestically as well as internationally. And so then that tilts the playing field towards dollar debt. And so what's attractive about that argument is it'll give us a nice way of thinking about dominance. It'll also generate another feature of the world, which is a convenience yield or a liquidity premium on both public debt as well as private debt that is an attraction to bringing us into dollars. And then a third point to talk to that I'll explain as I go through is this is a way of thinking about why both safe debt issuers, like banks around the world or multinationals, issue into the debt space. Why? Because they can issue debt that can capture some of the convenience yield in dollars, as well as riskier firms like a CCC firm issues in because there's a settlement benefit. If I choose to issue in debt in dollars, I can get my hands on other safe debt to extinguish my debt. So there's two economic mechanisms that I'm going to pursue.
But for buyers, it's easy, but for issuers, not, right? If for a German firm issuing dollars, a lot of T-bill doesn't really help with settlement.
It will still help. So hold the thought. Let's talk through the world as I go through this. Okay, so this is basically kind of the set of things that I want to talk about. As I talk through this, you will see that I'm going to talk about history a lot. I mean, part of it is to think about this question of reserve currency. There's just not a lot of variation in the data. So using history is useful. I'll try to talk through why it was that the sterling was the dominant currency during its period and why, for example, the French franc wasn't, or the German mark wasn't. And I'll talk through why, for example, the Dutch florin was the reserve currency rather than, for example, the Spanish coin, which was the Real de Ocho at the time. And then the other thing that I'm going to do when I talk about history is, if you just think about this issue in the abstract, there's potentially lots of explanations you can think of why the dollar is the reserve currency, right? We can point to economic size, trade centrality, military superiority. So there's lots of ideas that you can think of as being potentially important. When I go through the history, I'll try to make the argument that one commonality across all of the history that we have seen is this liquidity effect that I'm present. And so I'm going to argue it's actually the most important. Of course, it's hard to nail this down with data, so I'm just going to talk you through and make an argument along those lines. Okay. In terms of literature, there's a very large literature on reserve currencies, international monetary system, international financial system. I'm not going to do justice to talking about all of that. The main thing I'm going to say is that this idea that we're pushing is basically a kind of a liquidity-based idea. That is, we think that the reason we settle on dollars has something to do with the liquidity of the dollar money market. That's the main ideas I'm going to push in. Again, that might be different than another recent paper that I suspect some of you know is the Gopinath-Stein paper, which emphasizes, for example, trade and trade centrality and trade invoicing as being a driving force. So I'm going to take us in a different direction. At heart, the idea that I'm talking about is about supply of safe assets. The T-bill example I gave you, I think the way we think about the world is private debt anchors on a unit of denomination which anchors itself to the largest safe public float, T-bills as an example. Another way of explaining the theory that I'm going to present to you is if you imagine another world in which the US Treasury, for whatever reason, decided to issue all of its T-bills and denominate the payoff in the next period in renminbi, then we would argue that actually what might happen is that the world might shift to private denomination in renminbi, and maybe that's what would be the thing that would shift the world to renminbi. Okay, so that there's the key idea that we're going to play with is this idea that the denomination of a large supply of safe assets is the thing that anchors private debt decisions. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with just a historical example because it's a nice illustration of the forces that we're interested in. And I'm going to talk about the Dutch florin, which is a currency that circulated in the 17th and 18th centuries. So this is a period in which much payment is made in coin. And the difficulty in making payment in coin is, in Europe at the time, there's lots of coin. Lots of different coin, and coin with varying value, coin with value that you're not sure exactly what it's worth because it's been scraped down. So there's adverse selection problems in trading with coin, and then there's homogeneity, heterogeneity problems. Two different coins, how do you settle all of this? If you wrote a payment contract or a debt contract to hand over some coin on a given date in some place, how do you know you'll get the coin? So coin clearly inconvenient. The Bank of Amsterdam was chartered by the city, and it was chartered to create some order out of this chaos of payment settlement. And the basic idea of the bank was to create a homogeneous asset that merchants and investors could use to make payments, to make investments, to pay back debt contracts. Okay? The Bank of Amsterdam took initially deposits of coin, different types of coin, and would give its investors a ledger account denominated in florin. And if you as an investor then have some ledger account of florin, you can use that florin to make payments. The city of Amsterdam required that all local merchants, so Amsterdam, as you probably know, is a center of world trade at this time, and the main credit contract at this time with the bill of exchange, which is repayment in the future, required that these bill of payments be settled in florin. So merchants had very strong incentives to deposit coin in the bank and then collect a florin account and then use that florin account to settle their debt payments. Okay, so the Bank of Amsterdam is created in 1609. It kind of grows slowly, the quantity of florin under circulation. Initially, it's local merchants. Over time, it's merchants from not just Amsterdam, but also Rotterdam, for example. But by somewhere, 1700, the quantity of florin has really swelled, and you start to see what looks like what we think about as a reserve currency. The florin bill on Amsterdam is used outside of Amsterdam. So, for example, foreign exchange rates are all quoted relative to the Dutch florin, which is a lot similar to the way that the foreign exchange market works right now with respect to the dollar, and even more centrally to the idea that I'm going to be talking about. You would have a florin bill written on Amsterdam that would be traded by parties that were outside of Amsterdam. And that is a suggestion that the florin and settling your accounts in florin has value, not simply because you are located in Amsterdam, or say getting paid in Amsterdam, but because there's some underlying value. And this is a feature that we see in the world, right? The world of dollar debt currently is agreements to pay back in dollars, not just of US entities, but of entities all around the world. Okay. So the interesting thing about this period is if you just step back and ask, well, why? It's actually puzzling why the Dutch florin was centered on as this central currency. And I say that because there's a bunch of underlying fundamentals that might suggest that the currency that you should use would be the Spanish Real de Ocho. So Spain at this time is the wealthiest empire. It has the largest share of international trade. Right? Spain's connection to the Americas brings it lots of silver. And the most common metallic coin was the Spanish coin. So there's an alternative one could imagine, which is that we would write bills that would settle in the Spanish coin. But that's not the way the world works. The Spanish trade was roughly 6 times Amsterdam trade. So Amsterdam is a trade center of the world, but it's not the one that settles. And so I think our argument is the ledger technology is what centers the currency and the denominations in florin. That is, it's not size or trade, it's the ledger technology that's central here. And the ledger technology allowed a creation of a large supply of an asset, the florin, that was more usable than a bunch of different coin around the world. The second thing, and this is also something that I want to emphasize as I go through, is it's quite important over this period for a merchant or an investor to know that if I deposit my coin in the Bank of Amsterdam, that it won't be taken, right? It's not just that the Bank of Amsterdam provided a large quantity of florin. It was also that I was sure that that florin was backed in some way. This is an early stable coin. And so just as important is the bank is created in 1609, and it sort of develops a reputation over time. And in the early part, they would open up their doors to allow people to come and inspect the vaults and make sure that the coins are still in there. So it develops a reputation. 1684 is an important thing. They create a repo contract. I'll talk about this actually more tomorrow, which really explodes the quantity of florin. But it's financial technology and commitment that, in our mind, is the central thing that situates the currency in the florin. Yeah, Atif.
Is the exchange rate of florin fixed in terms of gold?
No. So I think the exchange there's a market at this time for exchanging florin for the current guilder, which is the local coin in Amsterdam, and that price varies. For the most part, so you could deposit guilder and get florin. For the most part, if you deposited 1 guilder, you'd get less than 1 florin, and it's a way of arguing also that the florin was more valued than the current guilder, which was the physical representation of florin. So there are exchange rates. It's not explicitly backed by gold. Somewhere in the early part of the Bank of Amsterdam, you have an explicit right of withdrawal. So you deposit coin, you can get coin back.
What does that mean if it's not fixed?
Yeah. So early, that's what happens. Sometime, I don't remember the date, it switches to fiat. So no right to withdraw. And then in 1684, the new technology that's introduced, which is really what increases the coffers at the bank, is a repo technology, where you bring the bank any coin, and this was largely large value trade coins at the time, and the bank would say, okay, you have coin, I will give you 90% of its value as a deposit account in the bank, and I will give you a receipt which allows you to reverse that transaction in the next few months. You can see what's attractive about that. We don't have to decide on the value. You can bring multiple different coins in, and all of it allows you to create florin at the bank. And the quantity of bank florin really explodes during this period. So that's basically a repo contract in which we don't have to agree on the value, but we're able to convert coin into backing, which is florin. And so it removes some of this question about exchange rate and explicit backing. Yeah.
How volatile was the Spanish coin compared to the florin? Because whenever a ship came with a silver load, was it more volatile than the florin?
I don't know the answer to that question. Right. Yeah, I think we have, and by the way, everything I'm telling you, I don't know that much about Amsterdam per se. Everything I'm telling you is from reading the work of Quinn and Robards, who are really the experts on this. And there's 2 pictures that I have focused on in their work that is really interesting. One is the exchange rate between florin and the local currency, and there you can see the confidence in the florin, because you see there's a period in the mid-1600s, there's a war, European historians will know which war I'm talking about, where the agio goes down, the florin value falls to less than 1, and there's sort of a reduction in quantity. And then right at the end of this period, the Bank of Amsterdam fails basically because at some point the bank takes the specie and starts lending it to the Dutch East India Company, which then starts to take losses, and then there's a war, and then there's a bank run. So by 1815, the bank is wound down. The exchange rate, the agio goes less than 0 by around 1790. So that's roughly the history of this period. Yeah, Nassim.
So how do you disentangle the relative effects of having this standardized technology and this standardized currency versus the credit worthiness that comes from this commitment not to.
Okay, so again, I don't have an empirical paper here. I'll talk through history, but for us, it feels like the critical thing is backing, quantity of safe backing. And so then you can see there's sort of two forces there. You can have a larger quantity, but if it's not backed, not so good. So quantity of safe backing is the important thing. In fact, during the period in which the banks finally starts to fail, the agio goes down, quantity goes down. In principle, if you just thought about it as why couldn't we continue to use florin even though it's less valued, as the conversion rate between agio and local florin and local currency changes? And the answer must be something like it's not as safe, and so I'm not as comfortable holding this. So in my mind, I want to think fundamentally about quantity of safe debt as being the critical thing. But I don't have a way of saying this other than the demise of currencies in my history looks sure like the end of safety. It seems to be what kills it.
Why couldn't other banks get into the florin business?
The Bank of Amsterdam was the provider of florin. So you're saying couldn't we just recapitalize the bank? Or
I thought maybe there's some other bank who said we're going to open a florin registry. What prevents them from
nothing. They could have done that, right? And in some sense, what happens in the end of this period is this is all metal backing, right? So we're just putting names on particular currencies. What happens at the end of this period is the world switches to the sterling. And what is the sterling? It's gold-backed or sterling-backed pound notes.
No, I mean, just like in the U.S., we had bank-issued money that competed with each other. I was just wondering why it didn't happen.
You didn't have so prior to this period, you had multiple monies issued. I mean, like the history before this is you want to think about the Italian city-states, which have multiple monies. You had the Venetian lira, the Florentine florin. So you had multiple monies, in some sense locally backed. Why couldn't another bank have done it? The Bank of Amsterdam did this in size. I think that was somehow important. Couldn't multiple banks have issued the same money? Maybe, but the history you're talking about in the U.S. with free banking turns out those monies were not perfectly substitutable. So maybe better off of one balance sheet. But yeah, at some level, this is the central set of questions, which is what I see from this history is homogeneity of a money issue that you're sure is the same, which ensures that there's value. So, I'll talk about this a bit tomorrow, but if you think about Gary Gorton's work, the heart of being able to trade is we all have to agree that this is the asset and it's the only asset. If you give me two currencies to trade, who knows, right? And even during the gold standard period, really at some level, all currencies are backed by gold. But why is it that the sterling is chosen as the dominant currency? And the answer must be there's in some states of the world, it's not. And so you're not sure. And so that is enough to create a difference between these two things. So I think my answer would be something like that. And I think that's related to Yassine's question as well. Yeah.
But sometimes you have something like cheapest to deliver for futures.
Right.
You go a little bit beyond just a narrowly defined. How does this fit?
The Bank of Amsterdam actually looks like the cheapest to deliver thing because you could, the contract, the repo contract was give me coin, many different coin, and I will give you florin against it. So multiple assets could be used to be dropped off at the bank to get the asset that you really want, which is florin. And so then you're not squeezed into just one currency, right? But then the private debt that's written, the bill of exchange is written to deliver in florin, but everyone knows I can get the florin I need to in order to settle my debts. So I think that's the sense in which it's the technology is set up so that you won't get into a squeeze. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take these ideas, put them into a model. I'll break the model presentation into two steps. I'll start off within a country. Of course, the main interest that I'm after is to ask a question about a firm denominating its debt in a foreign currency. But just to put the economics on the table, I'm going to do it within country, and then I'll add two countries, and then we can talk about where we really want to go. Okay, so here's the model. It's really a mix between the Holmstrom-Tirol liquidity demand model as well as you'll see Duffy, Garliano, Pedersen's OTC bond market model. So it's sort of a mix between two, I think, fairly well-known papers. There's 3 agents we need to keep track of: firms, entrepreneur-owned firms, a government, and investors. Start with the government. The government issues some bonds at time 0. G bonds are issued. What is a bond? It's a 3-period model. So issue a bond at time 0. The bond pays off at time 1 with face value 1. Okay, so G bonds are issued by the government, each with face value 1, with a promised payoff at time 2. There are entrepreneurs who are making an investment and financing decision. They have an investment project that they can invest in. The investment project costs beta squared. They have no money, so they need to raise debt in order to finance this. And it generates profits of 1. Okay, we'll make assumptions that it's always a good idea to invest and finance this with debt. What debt do they issue? They issue debt, again, face value 1, so basically the same as government bonds, maturing at time 2. Okay, so our entrepreneurs are going to issue debt at time 0, paying off at time 2, and they're going to generate profit of 1, and then they'll use the profit of 1 to repay the debt. There are investors who buy the bonds and therefore provide the beta squared necessary for investment. Investors have large endowments, and for the search bond market part of this model, assumption that each investor can invest only in 1 bond. So it's 1-0. If you've played with these models, discreteness is useful. So each investor can only invest in 1 bond. That's preferences. So beta is the discount rate. I'm going to, for much of the talk, assume that the corporate bonds issued by the firms and the government bond are the same. They have 0 default risk. They will be paid back for sure. Okay? So they'll have the same price. And we break symmetry in the paper. I don't think I'm going to do it in the slides. Okay? The total number of bonds issued at time 0 is the sum of the number of bonds that the firms issue, which is F bonds, and G, which is the number of bonds that the government issues. So F plus G is the total number of bonds issued at time 0. So MI is a thing that I'm going to come back and talk about at various times. Okay, so
The bonds are in terms of they pay when it's a consumption good.
at time 2.
It's all the same.
So let's at this point, it doesn't matter, right?
In terms of florin, just think about the good is a florin.
Think of the good as a florin. That's exactly right. Or I think the way you really should think about this is that the government bond is promising 1 florin. The private bond can decide what to denominate in and will optimally denominate in the florin as well. That's what is going to happen. Okay, so here's the central element of the model. So as I said, the firms are going to borrow for 2 periods. We're going to assume that there's potentially a timing mismatch. In particular, they may receive profits at either date 1 or date 2. So this sort of diamond in Vegas. And if they get their profits at time 1 and their debt is due at time 2, then they have a demand for a settlement asset. This is the bond intuition I started off with in the intro. They want to get their hands on an asset that they can use to eliminate the debt at time 2. Okay, so that's the liquidity demand part of this model. Probability of early profits is phi. So the mass of firms who have a demand for a bond at time 1 in order to settle their debt payments at time 2 is phi f, where phi is this probability.
Sorry, can you not store the good and pay your debt in the good?
You can.
Okay.
So there's 2 options. You can store the good or you can buy an asset. It'll turn out, hold on 1 second, it'll turn out to be a better idea for you to buy an asset. Okay. So consumption streams, if you get paid at time 2, then what do the firms do? They sink cost beta squared. They sell bonds at time 0, price pre-0, so that's their initial consumption. That's what the investors pay off at time 0. And then at time 2, the investors get back 1. The firm uses the profit at time 1 to pay off its debt, so it gets no profit at time 2. Here's what happens if you're in the interim. And Ricardo, this is the answer to your question. So in the middle period, suppose that the firm gets its goods. It could store the good. We're going to assume that its rate of return on storage is 0. So it could store the good and hold it till time 2 to pay it off. But a better trade, because the investors discount the future at rate beta less than 1, a better trade would be to give the good to the investor, get the bond from the investor. Effectively, that would be like the entrepreneur earning the return 1 over beta, and use the bond to pay off the debt claim at time 2. That's a strictly better. Tell me if that makes sense, right? So the assumption here is that you can use goods, but it's an inferior way to pay off your debt because the investor discounts the future at rate beta. He'd rather consume today and give you his bond. And then you can hold his bond and then use the bond to pay off the debt. So you're better off trying to get your hands on this financial claim to pay off your debt.
So the investor discounts beta, so he prefers
Everybody discounts the world at beta.
Okay.
The entrepreneur looks at he's got goods. He has to pay off his debt by the default cost infinity, right? That's consumption non-negativity earlier. So he needs to move goods between here and here to pay off the debt. A better way to move the goods is to give the investor the bonds, the goods, get the bond, and use the bond to pay off the debt.
Does it matter? Has no leftover. If he had some extra consumption, he would also discount beta, no?
It would. So consumption. So he has no other endowment. All of his is tied up in the project.
So he ends up with no.
Ends up with nothing. So what he ends up with is really he ends up consuming basically at time 0, right? He sells debt at some price, and that's his profit from doing all of this.
I guess if you could fraction, you could sell a bit of.
A little bit, yeah. So I don't feel like that's going to make a huge difference. I mean, what have we done here? We've created a liquidity demand, right? And it's just to situate this, it's a financial liquidity demand. In order to settle my debts, I need to get my hands on an asset. That's the whole purpose, and that's what the timing mismatch does for us. We've definitely pushed it kind of in a corner. You have nothing else, so you have to do your liquidity this way. Okay.
The entrepreneur get slightly additional consumption if the profit is early?
Yes, he does. So what happens at time 1, and that's what is here. So there's a surplus. If we can find a trade between the entrepreneur and the investor at time 1, the surplus is 1 minus beta, because that's the storage return versus the discount rate. Our assumption is that there's a bilateral matching market. I'll spell this out in the next slide. The entrepreneur gets a fraction eta of that surplus. The investor gets a fraction 1 minus eta of the surplus. 1 minus beta is positive, so relative to your question. So he gets potentially a little bit of consumption here, and potentially a little bit of consumption here. So this is what I've just said. And if you are following along, it's optimal for the firms to issue debt and to invest. Okay. All right. So let me talk about this date 1 market, which is in a sense the key to what we want to think about. So we have firms who have a need for liquidity. They need liquidity. The early firms, FIF firms, in order to pay off their debt at time 2. What is the liquidity? Well, it's really the bonds that are out there, right? There's some bonds issued by firms, and there are bonds issued by the government. So that's what you need to get your hands on in order to settle this trade. Who has the bonds? It's the investors. So at time 1, there are investors who have bonds. They have these corporate bonds and these government bonds. They're identical in terms of payoff characteristics. So get your hands on any of these bonds. If I match with an investor, that's the matching function I'm going to assume. Okay, lambda is like just a scale parameter that affects your overall matching rate. Theta is a curvature parameter in the matching function. For the most part, in today's talk, I'm going to show you results for the case where theta equals 1, which, by the way, is the Duffy-Garliano-Pedersen exact result. Take two masses, MF and MI, mix them with Poisson meeting rates lambda, you'll get a matching rate of lambda, MF, MI. So
your initial intuition about not being able to, you not wanting to be squeezed in not being able to deliver.
yes,
I mean, here you can always deliver.
yes.
It's just a more profitable way.
It's more profitable way, yeah. I mean, another way of doing this would have said, you can't deliver. The goods die right away. And then that would be an extreme intuition. All we need is just some benefit to delivery, right? So 1 minus beta is basically that kind of benefit to early delivery. Okay, so here's the key thing we're assuming. And the DGP case is theta equals 1. We need theta to be bigger than half. What does theta bigger than a half gives you? It gives you increasing returns in matching. So if you double the masses, MF and MI. If theta is bigger than 1/2, you more than double the number of matches. So that's the critical assumption which we're making here. And it's effectively this type of matching function is going to give you naturally a thick market externality, right? And I would argue that it is a basic feature of the way financial markets operate. So this is a common way of looking at financial market trading, is if we have more, we're going to get more matching. So meeting probabilities, alpha F is the probability a firm finds a bond seller. That's the total number of matches divided by the mass of firms. Alpha F is going to be important, so will MF. Alpha I is the probability a seller finds a firm, which is the total number of matches divided by the mass of investors. All right, so let's then come back to the date 0 issuance utility for an entrepreneur. So you can break this issuance utility for an entrepreneur into two pieces. One is, if he's early, he would like to get his hands on a bond, which happens with probability alpha F, and he realizes surplus 1 minus beta. So that's the settlement benefit of being in a market. If alpha F is high, that's a more liquid market. I like issuing into that market. So where I'm going to take us in this direction of issuing in currency A or currency B. So one piece of this is alpha F. Another piece of the decision for the entrepreneur is P0. I issue my bonds at time 0. If I can issue my bonds at a high price, great deal. I'd like to issue bonds at high prices. So let's then talk about the price P0. We're going to assume that at time 0, the bond market is Walrasian, right? So bidders, these investors, just bid competitively for these bonds. What that means is the investors get no surplus. All the surplus from investment will flow into the entrepreneurial utility. So in particular, what is P0? Well, I as an investor have a bond. It could be that I'm not matched at time 1, in which case I value the future at discount rate beta square. And so that's just a standard present value of my bond. But here's the benefit of holding a bond. It could be, on the other hand, that I get matched at time 1, and my bond is now used for settlement purposes, in which case I get a little extra bit, 1 minus eta times 1 minus beta. So you can just rewrite this, and you get a very nice expression, which is P0 minus beta squared will reflect a convenience yield. What is the convenience yield? It's basically the portion of the surplus that goes to the bondholder times the probability of the bondholder matching. And the way we've written the model, actually all of this flows back to the issuer. All right, so the way the model is written is issuers at time 0 issue bonds. These bonds carry a convenience yield. Why? Because they're useful for settlement at time 1. So in particular, again, the economics of this is bonds are valuable as settlement instruments. So the benefit of issuing in a given currency has to do with how many settlement instruments are out there. And also the benefit for an issuer is if I can issue an asset that will be used as a settlement instrument, good deal. Now, when I think about this in the world, I actually think these are probably two different issuers. I'm going to say that a safe debt issuer, like a multinational or a bank that's issuing into the dollar debt market, is probably mainly getting the convenience benefits of issuing a debt. Whereas, let's say a triple C rated firm, its debt is probably not convenience yield debt, but it still wants to issue into the dollar market because it gets settlement benefits into the dollar debt market, which are provided by other bonds. In the paper, we work out the case where these two things happen by two different firms. What I'm going to walk you through is that the same firm gets both convenience yields as well as settlement liquidity. Okay? And again, it's obvious, but if the reason I call this a convenience yield is because if we set alpha I to 0, which is to say that the matching rate, a bond is illiquid, then it has no convenience yield. Its value is beta squared. So the extra bit is coming from its use as a settlement instrument. So this is what I've written down. That's the utility benefit, the convenience yield, and the benefit of liquidity. You can substitute in for P0 as well as for alpha F from the previous expressions, and then you get a nice relation between the utility benefit of issuing in currency F, the convenience yield, The convenience yield now is increasing in the mass of firms who are issuing into this currency. Why? Because when you have a bigger mass of firms issuing into a given currency, there's going to be more liquidity demand, and so bonds will carry a higher convenience yield. So MF is going to matter. And where we're going with this is, in a second, I'm going to put this into two currencies. One second, Arthur. I'm going to put this into two currencies, and MF and MI are going to be endogenous, because when a firm from currency B decides to issue in currency A, it's going to change the mass of firms issuing into currency A. Likewise, there's a benefit of liquidity, which depends upon the number of bonds available at time 1. If I'm an early guy, I need settlement liquidity, and which is now a function of the number of bonds available, MI, which is also going to be endogenous to the decision between two currencies. Okay, so MF and MI are endogenous. We're going to go with that as we go through. At present, they're just exogenous, and this just tells you the two pieces that show up in utility. Yeah.
So I can see a dominant currency emerging, but why does the convenience yield not be driven down to 0 when it comes? So the government can keep issuing, and
so I'm just going to fix a supply of government bonds out there, and then firms are going to issue limited number of projects effectively, right? And I think this, in a way, this relates back to these questions we had earlier. How much can you commit? So it's sort of maximal committable amount of issuance is what is driving all of this. Okay, so just to put this in context, this is the way we've described the model is this date 1 model and market in which some firms, some investors have bonds, and some other guys need the bonds for settlement purposes. If you ask me, I would say, well, that's one way of thinking about it. But throughout history, there's probably market structures that might be like an OTC bond market along the lines of what I've just described. It could be a banking system that delivers the surplus from the bonds to the investors, to the firms. The key thing is it's the supply of bonds is what matters. F plus G is what drives things. So for example, if I think about the dollar money market today, I think of the assets as being, say, treasuries and mortgages. Dealers can access reserves via repo markets, and it's ultimately reserves that are used to settle assets. But the base for reserves that the dealer can get is the supply of assets out there, treasuries and mortgages, which is what he's using in order to get the liquidity to the investor who wants. In the world today, when we think about reserve currencies, we often think internationally, right? And I actually think this model can capture what we think of as international foreign exchange reserves. So, for example, imagine that the investors are, say, a foreign central bank. They have some firms who have issued dollar debt. And it's preferable for the central bank to be the investor to hold the bonds at time 0 so that it's in a position to deliver the bonds to the firm that needs settlement liquidity at time 1. So that immediately gives you a theory of why a foreign central bank might want to hold reserves. We're not going to go there, but I think one can fit a bunch of facts about who holds assets and who needs assets into this model. The key point is that the supply of dollar assets, total quantity of dollar assets, is what limits liquidity in this model. Yeah.
There's an implicit assumption, it seems, that in the international version, that the consumption good is always tradable. And I'm trying to think how this will change if that was not the case. So part of what I produce is a consumption good that is specific to the country I live in.
I don't think I'm making any assumptions about the consumption. I think I could.
You can't depend then where the investor is situated.
Because
they care about consumption where they live. They don't care about producing haircuts in Bangladesh.
Yeah, let me think about it. I don't. Yeah, let me think about it and try to give you a better answer. I don't have an answer off the top of my head. I think you're right. Kind of in the background, I'm assuming that there's a bunch of goods and we can trade all of this stuff. But let me think a little bit and see if I can give you a better answer. Yeah.
At the end of the day, you have a model of why we need a storage technology.
Yeah.
And rather,
Yeah.
abstracted from safety, you focused on liquidity, but we know they're related.
It's safe and liquidity. You need a safe and liquid storage. Yeah.
So I don't think regardless of where you are, you need this asset.
Yeah.
I think it shouldn't matter.
Yeah, I don't think it should matter. I don't have a crisp answer to your question, which is why I need to think a little bit. But I'm pretty sure that, as Mark said, it's the supply of safe liquid stuff, and everybody in the world is using it. The way I think about the world internationally is There are firms in Bangladesh who issues dollar debt. It's probably in the interest of the Bangladesh central bank to hold the liquidity, maybe to settle their debts if need be. And so then it's just about financial flows and finding effective ways to manage financial flows, which is kind of what this model is about. Yeah.
Just if you think about new technology, improving the matching technology, like,
Yeah. Lambda is what in this model. Yeah. That will make a currency more attractive because it's also showing up. Yes. So let me talk about this. Okay. So this is basically where I'm going to go. So let's put this in two countries, and I think you probably have the idea of where we're going to go. So I'm going to assume two countries, A and B. Each country has some fundamentals. GJ, supply of government debt in that country, again, safe government debt. FJ, the number of firms in that country. Lambda J, Marcus, this is, say, the matching technology. And we have firms in each country that have to make a decision. Do I want to issue in my home currency or foreign currency? Okay, that's the only decision that firms really have to make. I'm going to assume that firms in a given country, index them by I. If they go abroad, then they're mismatching their revenues and their liabilities. So they potentially have some currency mismatch costs. This is why, Atif, I want to be slow in answering your question. I'm going to assume that there's some potential currency mismatch if you are getting local revenues and are issuing abroad. There's a model in the paper that ties the currency mismatch cost. It turns out all we really need to do is say that there's some cost ki if you issue foreign, and it varies across firms. Okay, so think of a distribution of firms with varying ki. And so what we'll end up getting is an equilibrium in which some firms decide to issue at home and some firms decide to issue abroad. Okay, so we can summarize the equilibrium. The endogenous object is the masses of firms who are issuing in A, bonds in A, in B, etc. So their endogenous decisions are going to determine these masses. Firms face decisions over, do I, as an A firm, want to issue in A? That's a function of the masses. Do I, as an A firm, want to issue in B? That's a function of the masses and my currency mismatch cost, ki. Likewise for B firms. These are the four objects which we need to pay attention to. Maybe it's immediately clear. If it's not, just take it. But on face value, that the equilibrium is going to have a threshold structure. There's some k bar threshold such that firms whose costs are less than k bar will choose to issue abroad. Everyone whose costs are higher will choose to stay at home. Right? That's the only variation across firms is the cost. So you're going to get a nice threshold structure. I'm going to assume that firms are distributed. Ki is indexes firms. H of ki is a distribution of firms. And for most of the pictures I'm going to draw you, I'm going to use a Pareto CDF. If you look at the paper, it gives you more general conditions for what we need to characterize the equilibrium, which we're doing. Okay? So immediately that tells you that if you tell me k bar, the threshold, H of k bar will issue abroad. So if H of k bar issue abroad, then the masses are actually just a function of k bar. And so what I'm going to be particularly interested in describing to describe the equilibrium is ask the following question, and you can guess where this is going to go. There's going to be an indifference condition. There's the firm k bar is the firm for whom saying issuing at home versus abroad has equal cost. Okay, that's going to pin down the equilibrium. All right, so this is the formal definition of the equilibrium. There's some k hat, which is an equilibrium value of the threshold such that firm with k equal to k hat is indifferent between issuing at home and abroad. And then given the value k hat, these are what the masses have to be endogenously. Let me just make this more concrete and go to the case of what we call the BA specialization, which is firms in B decide that they want to invest in A. Okay, in that case, what happens? The utility from issuing in foreign currency for a B firm is these masses, and these are these two effects I've talked to you about before, convenience yield and settlement benefits minus cost k hat. And then if I issue in B, I don't pay the cost, but I'm suffering whatever the local quantities are. Okay? And then given a k hat, there's some market clearing conditions which determines these masses. So let's just characterize the equilibria. There are 5 equilibria. Let me show them to you on a picture, and this will, I think, should be fairly clear now. Right, so let's think now of varying the threshold.
So in that, so you've made the asymmetry is not in terms of bargaining powers or anything like that, right?
Yeah, actually, in everything I'm going to do, I'm going to make eta half. So equal split of bargaining power in all the pictures I've shown you. Eta doesn't really matter.
So that condition is just basically the costs will be the same as the matching rates differential.
Sorry, which condition? This condition?
Yeah, the cap.
This is the condition that's going to determine the marginal firm, right?
So the lambda times is the matching rate.
Lambda is the matching rate. That's the utility from issuing in currency A, which reflects a convenience yield, which is proportional to MFA, as well as a settlement benefit of issuing in currency A, which is proportional to MIA, the number of settlement assets in currency A.
I guess my question is, prices are implicit in there.
Prices are already in there. All the prices are in there.
Okay, so we don't
I've substituted all the prices.
so those M's have that.
All the M's have the prices. That's exactly right. The M's have all of the prices in them, right? And so as more M goes in, some different things are changing in these prices. I like to write it this way because really the economics are driven by 2 pieces. The convenience yield, which is a function of how many firms are in your currency, and the number of bonds, which is MIA. Okay, picture, I think this is the main analysis if you want this picture. What happens in equilibrium? Let's consider varying the threshold, K bar, and drawing the utility of a B firm issuing in B. As you move the threshold K bar up, what's happening is more firms are issuing in currency A. As a B firm, my utility for issuing currency B is going down. There's less firms issuing in B, which means the convenience yield in currency B is falling. That's the price, Ricardo. And then there's less bonds in currency B, so I have less settlement liquidity available to you. Not as attractive, that's the downward slope. The blue curve is the benefit for a B firm issuing in A, which is increasing because as more firms start to issue in A, as we start pushing the threshold to the right, more bigger convenience yield in A and more bonds available for settlement. So that gets you the upward slope. What gets you the downward slope is that as we push to the right, the marginal firm is changing to a firm with a higher cost. So that gets you the downward slope. So as we've drawn it, there are, in this case, 3 equilibria. There are interior equilibria where the K bar is such that we're indifferent between issuing these 2 currencies. And then the way we've written it, we're going to assume that there's a lower bound on support of K so that there's an other equilibrium which is potentially stable where no firm switches. Okay? So every firm just stays in their own currency, and that's also potentially stable because there are some switching costs involved. This equilibrium is unstable. If I push mass to either to the left or to the right, I'll either end up at 0 or I'll end up over here at 2. So the only equilibria really are 0 and 2. That's what I have to focus on.
Sorry, A and B is symmetric?
So sorry, what I'm doing currently is I'm doing the model with symmetric fundamentals. I'm going to break symmetry in a few minutes.
But when you do this, you must be assuming so that we consider the A firms always do A.
So there's 2 classes of equilibria. There's BA equilibria, in which I think about the case where B firms issue in A. And way I think your question is, there's totally another equivalent set of equilibria in the symmetric world where A firms issue in B. Of course, it's a symmetric model at present, right? And so in that case also, there are 2 equilibria. There's a stable equilibrium in which nobody issues abroad. And then there's an equilibrium in which currency B is the dominant currency, which is this one over here. Okay, so really there are 3 equilibria in this totally symmetric case. There's a no-switch equilibria, in which everyone just does their own thing. There's an equilibrium in which B is chosen as the dominant currency, and there's an equilibrium in which A is chosen as the dominant currency. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about history and sort of run it through the lens of this model. The way I think about the world prior to Amsterdam is we had Italian city-states, which were kind of the dominant traders of this world, who were effectively issuing their own currencies. They were prominent, but there was no dominant currency, and I think of that as the no-switching equilibrium. we had roughly symmetric liquidity pools in all of these states, and we're sort of stuck there. And that was the world until the advent of Amsterdam. What Amsterdam does is, as we've described, they create this ledger technology and this capacity to expand supply. Okay? At heart, what that does is it increases GA, the quantity of safe assets, government-supplied safe assets in aid. It gives you a technology to increase GA. So to go back to this picture, what does that do? Focus on this left equilibria, and let's imagine that currency A is Amsterdam, currency B is Spain. Okay? Amsterdam creates this ledger technology. We increase GA. That increases the utility for a firm in country B, Spain, to issue into currency A. That pushes this curve up. If you start off from, say, the no-switch equilibrium case, and you start shifting this curve up, eventually the blue curve crosses the orange curve, and so everyone switches over, and we destroy the no-switch equilibrium because it's strictly better to issue into currency A. On the other hand, if we're playing this equilibrium here, where there's already a lot of switch that's happened, as we increase GA, A is becoming more attractive as a currency to issue into, and so more firms choose to issue in A. So increasing GA makes A more attractive. Starting from a place in which we're symmetric, as we increase GA, we potentially dissolve the symmetric equilibrium. And then eventually, we move to an equilibrium which looks like dominance.
I guess this figures depict the marginal firm, the welfare of the marginal firm. But if you look at total welfare,
Yeah.
is it welfare enhancing?
It's welfare enhancing. I haven't shown that to you, but I have short time, but I will try to show it to you. Right? Absolutely.
But for all the firms, or?
No, it's not for all firms, because the firms that are stuck are now left with less liquidity. Right? So there's an interesting design problem of when do you want to create dominance and when do you not? When will B countries want to, say, subsidize A to create more liquidity, which is how I think about Bretton Woods.
So some firms in Italy or in Spain
Yep.
benefited from the Amsterdam.
Absolutely. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Wouldn't the first best be that both countries just issue a huge amount of their own bonds?
Issue a common debt. Is that what you're saying?
No, just
Yeah, absolutely. So that, I mean, Mark, this comes back to your in the background is the idea that there's a limited quantity, and this is Atta's question as well. There's a limited supply of safe. Well, you can't promise too much. I mean, that's
It's a limited,
fundamentally.
not a limited, and also there's a budget balance assumed in the background. Like you're not running large deficits.
Yeah. So in the background is
Something like that.
some idea of you can promise, but you can't overpromise, right? That yeah.
It doesn't affect private commitment. Like
Mhm.
in order to support the big government debt,
Yes.
you need to tax the
Yeah.
private citizen,
Yes.
and
Mhm.
the private citizen
Yes.
cannot recommit to pay.
Yeah.
Because you have to pay a lot.
That's
to
right.
the government.
Yep.
So
Mhm.
it does interact.
It does interact. Actually, there's a bunch of different interactions that start to show up once you open up the box, because if you issue more GA, you make your asset more attractive. You actually increase your convenience yield. So you can potentially loosen your budget constraint. So there's like a kind of a Laffer curve, if you want, of government debt, which because it endogenously makes your currency more attractive. And then there's the open empirical question, which side you're on at any time. And then there's also Nobu's point, which is something about your ability to raise taxes, which potentially is also a function of the economic activity in your local economy. If you make your currency more attractive, more settlement instruments, you probably have more economic activity. Maybe you also increase your tax base that way. Okay. We can also look at the other equilibrium in which we're a symmetric case. Let's pretend I am now Amsterdam. Amsterdam is the reserve currency. I'm England. Okay? What's happening over this period is right at the end of the 1700s, the amount of safe debt that Amsterdam can provide is shrinking. So GA is shrinking and GB is rising. The amount of safe debt that England is providing exiting the Napoleonic Wars is rising, and the world looks like it switches over to England. So what's happening in the background, the way we think about it is you're starting from a place in which Amsterdam is the dominant currency, but as you make Amsterdam's debt less attractive and UK debt, sterling debt, a bigger quantity of it, you increase the attraction of switching. And there's some quantity at which you dissolve the Amsterdam equilibrium and you switch to the sterling equilibrium, and that's kind of the way we think about the switch that happens from Amsterdam to Britain. Yeah.
But why didn't you switch to an equilibrium where UK people issue in pounds and Dutch people in foreign?
So it's possible that you could sort of stop halfway. You could move back to the middle point, which was the stable equilibrium in which exactly that happens, and then as you keep shifting, which is roughly what happens over this period, GA in Amsterdam is going down, GB in Britain is going up. At some point you dissolve the Amsterdam equilibrium, which looks like it happens, I don't know, let's say 1810, and then you've moved over fully to the other equilibrium.
I mean, there is these overlap periods, right, where both currencies are kind of.
So this is, yeah, I mean, I think in Amsterdam sterling it's a little less clear. Dollar, pound, there's definitely an overlap period. All right, I am running short on time, so I have to choose what I want to talk about. Let me just tell you, and another comparative study you can do is what if you change firm size? Right, I did a comparative static with respect to GA. Another comparative static you could do is respect FA or FB. Turns out that's not so clear. And the logic here is if Amsterdam is the reserve currency and the number of firms in Spain starts to increase, some of these firms, if Amsterdam is the dominant currency, will issue into Amsterdam, which will actually increase the liquidity of Amsterdam. So this is the sense in which size, economic size, is actually not the thing. The thing is really committed government supply that is in your local currency. That's the critical factor for us that drives things.
You could have picked market structure, like lambda.
I could have also picked market structure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what's happening this period is a mix of market structure as well as government debt. Okay, and maybe this is a nice connects to this next point that I want to talk through. So I'm going to write down the following. I'm going to think about the sovereign and its incentives to provide public assets or potentially to increase lambda. And here's the way I'm going to think about this. I'm going to think of a sovereign whose welfare is seniorage on its government debt, plus the utility of its domestic firms, who benefit from having more settlement liquidity in the domestic currency. And let's, for the sake of algebra, consider the equilibrium in which B firms are thinking of switching into A. Okay, I can also do the analysis the other way, but it's completely symmetric as you've seen so far. So B firms are switching into A. Here is just plugging in, that's WA, the welfare of A, and WB, the welfare of B. Now let me ask, I can do the following experiment. Let's imagine that country A thinks to itself, I can get my hands on a commitment technology which allows me to increase GA a little bit, right? Maybe I get some gold or something which allows me to increase GA a little bit. And I'm going to ask the question, is it more beneficial for country A to do it, country A being the dominant currency, or is it more beneficial for country B to do it? And the answer is it's strictly more beneficial for currency A to do it. Why? Because if you stare up here, first, the convenience yield in A is bigger. So issuing more government debt is more attractive for currency A. Second, there's an endogenous effect. If you issue more debt, some of my debt is being used as settlement instruments by firms in the country. So that's beneficial. And then there's a third endogenous effect, which is by issuing more GA, I draw more firms in. That increases both my convenience yields as well as the settlement liquidity available for my local firms. And so they're all happier if I can pull more firms into my currency. So for all those reasons, there's a bigger incentive to improve the amount of debt once you're the leader. It's asymmetric, so that if you kind of become a little bit dominant, you're going to go all the way and become much more dominant. There's a complementarity between dominance and investments. And so with regards to, I mean, your point, Ricardo, actually, if you think of improvements in lambda, which is like a financial technology of matching, the dominant currency will have more of an incentive to do that than the non-dominant currency. And the reason we find this attractive is that's a way of thinking about why a reserve currency is both a reserve currency for debt as well as the dominant financial system, which is roughly the way the US is.
B always has an incentive to do it, or it's actually sometimes negative?
Well, it depends. At this point, I haven't told you what the cost of creating G is. So
No, but even if it's like free, is it not like because
if it's free, then they want to do it, except they always want to do it.
even though the marginal guy is kind of doesn't take the externality into account, which the
All I can say is that A is strictly preferred to B. I can't tell you what I need a cost function to tell you.
In some sense, both governments face an upward demand curve for their debt, right?
They do, yeah. Yeah, so you're harvesting convenience, but the endogenous feedback is here is as you're pushing GA up, you're also drawing guys in, right? And so then actually
There's an amplification.
there's an amplification. Potentially your convenience yield doesn't rise as much if you're country A, because you're drawing demand in as you're pushing supply out.
in the B country, I would have thought the agents on the margin are not making necessarily an optimal decision. So the people that you're drawing back into using your currency by issuing more GB.
I mean, it's still a locally optimal. It is a Pareto question. I mean, so if you've understood the logic so far, I have 2 minutes left. So the underlying problem is a externality, right? There's a thick market externality. So you actually if you had a planner, he'd want more into A than into B, right? He'd want to strictly subsidize entry into A, and so that's a way we think about Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods is an arrangement in which all the gold is sent to the U.S. to back a large supply of dollars, and you could ask, and we do in the paper, like under what circumstances will B want to send its gold to A, recognizing that there's more liquidity available in A, which could benefit some of the B firms that switch, and that turns on the question as to how many firms there are in B versus how much government debt there is in B. That's the trade-off that comes up. So I am unfortunately out of time. I've handled my time poorly. And I'm just going to take you through, we can do a lot more stuff. Let me do one last thing, and then I'll conclude. I think one of the things I find attractive about this is a nice way of thinking about dollar swap lines. Okay, so far I've told you that G is committed G in all states of the world. Imagine a world in which the probability of getting the liquidity shock is phi omega, which is random. And let's suppose that the supply of government assets is also some random function of omega. Then the indifference condition that determines the marginal guy is now going to be a function of the covariance between the liquidity shocks and the supply of the stochastic amount of government assets. So for us, that's like a way of thinking about swap lines. Swap lines help to reinforce the dominant currency equilibrium because they're providing liquidity in exactly the states you want. It's also a way of thinking about why negative covariance, which is default, is bad. For example, why the euro suddenly stops to being as attractive a dominant currency because the supply of safe debt is shrinking exactly when you might need it in high liquidity states, whereas the US is able to do it no matter what. All right, so I'm going to conclude here. So I think we think about this as a nice way of thinking about the current dollar world. We have a world in which GA is very large, the US world, large supply of T-bills, Fed swap lines. All of this helps to reinforce the dollar dominant equilibrium. We've had investments in the US in financial technologies, repo, all of this sort of stuff, which is in some way or the other increasing lambda A. We have institutions to try to lower costs of dollar issuance. And then there's complementarities. I haven't talked much about this that will also reinforce all of this. And then there's the question that people often ask, which is, would it take for the renminbi to become dominant? And I think the answer is very clear. You don't have the asset base to support it. And I said this right at the beginning. Like one way maybe of having the renminbi is if the US was to issue renminbi T-bills. That's effectively what one needs in order to switch the currency. Okay, thank you very much.